Hi, I'm Sharon Pratt. I'm former mayor of Washington, D.C., and also the founder of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. We call it IPPH. IPPH is housed on the campus of the University of the District of Columbia with the mission of preserving and celebrating the history of Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. We have a variety of programs, and one of them is the type of program we have today. We're going to have a podcast where we're in the room with Jennifer Chiaverini. We're delighted to have her because she is a New York Times bestseller. She's written a great many books, and some of those books are historically based, including Mrs. Lincoln's Dressmaker. And this is a wonderful book. I read it when it first came out years ago. I guess the Washington Post or the New York Times brought it to my attention. I enjoyed it then. And then I read it recently in anticipation of our conversation today. It chronicles, in many ways, the life of a very interesting, unique woman, Elizabeth Keckley, who was a formerly enslaved woman who becomes the dressmaker for the First Lady, and ultimately, in many ways, is her most trusted confidant. It's quite a wonderful story and beautifully written. Uh, so it's an honor to have you with us.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So, what prompted you to delve into the life of Elizabeth Keckley? Because I asked that question because it's tough to find any scholarship around women of that period, much less a woman who's formerly enslaved. What inspired you to want to engage in this kind of deep dive?
Well, I first heard about Elizabeth Keckley when I was researching an earlier novel, and many of my novels do focus on the art of quilting. And in the course of researching Civil War era quilts, I came upon the description of a quilt that is now at the Kent State University Museum. And it was purported to be, although the provenance of this quilt isn't 100% certain, it was said to have been made by Elizabeth Keckley, who was Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker and confidant during Mary Lincoln's years as First Lady. And this quilt was said to have been made from scraps of all of the luxurious fabrics left over from those dressmaking sessions. And although this wasn't the subject of that particular book, that brief description and that photograph just immediately captivated my imagination because I thought of the intimacy between a woman of that era and her dressmaker, the amount of time they spend together in such close quarters, the confidences that are shared. And that when I thought of what that dressmaker must have overheard and what she might have witnessed while she was in this role, I marveled at it. I thought, what might have been said and what might she have seen that has been lost to the historical record? And that just stayed with me all those years later. And then as years went by, because this was back in the 90s when I first discovered this, time went by and I was researching another novel from that era, and I was looking at the book Team of Rivals and other historical works. And I noticed that so many of them referenced this same book called Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave, 4 Years in the White House. And I thought, well, this is interesting. They're all consulting this one book as this source of important historical information. And then so I wanted to know more about that book. And then when I saw the name Elizabeth Keckley, the same as the dressmaker who had made that quilt that I saw so many years ago, I was just absolutely astounded because until then, I wasn't aware that she was also an author. And so then, of course, I had to go right out and find a reprint of her memoir. And then all of those conversations, I imagined that the dressmaker would have overheard all of the things that she witnessed. I discovered that Elizabeth Keckley had described them in her own words. And then I wanted to know more. My imagination was just humming at that point. I wanted to know, well, what happened outside the scope of this book? And what happened during just everyday life in Washington, D.C., because those are some things that Ms. Keckley did not cover in her book, because everyday life in Washington, D.C. during those years would have been well known to her audiences, but not to a writer in the 21st century curious to know more. So I wanted to know everything that she didn't put into her memoir.
Hard to interrupt your train of thought because it's such an interesting journey that you have taken. And she is an unusual woman. I mean, how she managed to move to this position, having been formerly enslaved, and then having the resolve and fortitude to work her way towards freedom, by her freedom and the freedom of her son.
Yes.
Um, but she came to Mary Todd Lincoln's attention, as I understand it, and based upon your writing and some others, that she worked previously for Jefferson Davis's wife, right? And even Robert E. Lee's wife. Is that correct?
She worked for Verena Davis, and she also worked for Mrs. Douglas, who was President Lincoln's rival on the campaign trail for so many years. But Elizabeth Keckley was in DC before the Lincolns arrived, before Abraham Lincoln was elected. And through her own innate skills, her training, her gifts as an entrepreneur, she quickly established herself as the dressmaker for Washington's elite. So when Mary Lincoln came to town and needed a dressmaker, because she had come from the frontier of Illinois, and she knew that to make her place in Washington, she had to look the part. Well, one of her friends recommended Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley went to an interview and immediately won her over by making sort of a test dress, by remodeling or refurbishing one that she had already had. And she soon became very, very busy handling all the dressmaking orders from Mrs. Lincoln, while also continuing her dressmaking business with other women in Washington who just absolutely relied upon her for all of the dresses that they would need for important society events.
Since you have such a focus on quilting, when you saw what she had done, do you think that, and did you see a skill, a quality that set her apart?
There was certainly so much extraordinary artistry that went into that quilt. It was sort of in the crazy quilt style, which was very popular at the time when the quilt was said to have been made. And it incorporated not only fine stitching, but also incredible embroidery. Important dates and things were inscribed and memorialized in that quilt, as was the custom for that style. But I think people in DC can see examples of Elizabeth Keckley's work for themselves. One of the gowns that she sewed for Mary Lincoln is on display in the Smithsonian right now, and I certainly made a trip to see that for myself. And it's one thing to read descriptions of her beautiful artistry, because it really is a work of art, the elaborate sewing and fitting. Every dress had to be precisely custom made to the individual wearer. And seeing her work in the Smithsonian on display, giving this place of honor, was certainly very moving. And it absolutely confirmed all of the testimonials to her extraordinary skill as a dressmaker, to see it on display.
How long would it take, let's say, to make one of these gowns?
Well, for someone like Miss Keckley, who not only did the work herself, but had apprentices and other trainees working for her, it could take anywhere from several weeks to several months. And that process involved measuring the client, discussing the client's needs, what sort of fabric they desired, and then any number of fittings, and then, tailoring to make the dress fit exactly right.
You also not only tell us about, I mean, you don't focus as much on her skills as a seamstress, as a couture, so to speak, at that time, but her inner feelings. I mean, how she navigated this complicated space, complicated in the sense that, she formerly enslaved woman working for somebody who herself was the child of enslavers,
Yes.
living at a time of such tension. But I think you really do capture an authenticity about what she probably thought. Some of it you may have garnered from her own writings, but how was that journey of trying to really get a grasp of her thinking and sentiments?
That is one of the most challenging aspects of writing historical fiction. And with a character like Elizabeth Keckley, who is based upon a historical figure, someone that I read about and have come to admire so much, it's especially important to me to get it right. So when you're reading historical fiction and you are reading about the character's thoughts and personal feelings and conversations with other characters that could not possibly have been part of the historical record, then you do have to know that a lot of that is the product of the novelist's imagination. What I always try to do in my historical fiction is to learn as much about the historical figure I can, both from their own writing, if, as in the case of Elizabeth Keckley, I'm fortunate enough that something exists, but also upon what other people, other contemporaries might have written about that person. Perhaps what was written in a newspaper interview, or in someone else's letters, or in that person's own letters. And then I try to get all that together to get a good idea of what that person was like and what they might have done in a certain situation and what they might have felt when confronted with a particular problem or new experience. And then knowing what I know of the historical figure, then I try to hold as truly as I can to what they have said and what is known about them when I am creating their imagined life. Now,
But you have to manage, I think, to pick up on the subtleties of those complicated relationships and how she may have reacted to something Mary Todd Lincoln said, which I gather from your novel, you perceived her as being very fond of the First Lady.
she was, and I think that they had an interesting relationship, and it was, of course, complicated by the fact that there was this power imbalance. You know, there was someone
Yes.
who was not really an employee, but, you know, because of matters of race and class, they were the same gender, so they had that in common. But Mary Lincoln was the first lady, so it was never really a friendship of equals. But they both did benefit from this relationship. Mary Todd Lincoln's friendship gave Elizabeth financial incentives, financial security, and also gave her an entree into another level of Washington society, which was very good for her business. And then, of course, Elizabeth provided not only her extraordinary skill, but she was wise and she was understanding. She could be patient with Mary's very difficult personality in a way that other people often became too exasperated with her to tolerate for long. And I think that there were moments when Elizabeth did lose patience with her. Sometimes Mary did demand too much, but uh, Elizabeth just was able to understand Mary and sympathize with her and empathize with her in a way that Mary desperately needed in a situation where she was not popular in Washington. And she, of course, had all these burdens with being the first lady at a time of war. And then, of course, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Elizabeth was there for her in her time of extraordinary grief and helped her get through that, in part because of her loyalty to Mary and her friendship with Mary, but also because of her respect and admiration for the late president, whom she admired very much.
Do
And
you think she had influence over the president? I know that people speak of how Frederick Douglass pushed Lincoln around the issue of emancipation. And then, of course, Lincoln contemplated having recently emancipated shipped to other countries. Do you think Keckley played a role in changing his thinking on that.
I do believe she did, not perhaps as an advisor in the way Frederick Douglass served and worked with Lincoln, but I think by being in the household and by engaging in conversations and learning about Elizabeth's needs and about, what her life was like as a self-emancipated woman in Washington, D.C., especially when there was still slavery in Washington, D.C., and learning about Elizabeth's commitment to other slaves, formerly enslaved people who came to DC and were called contraband, her founding of the Contraband Relief Association to see to these needs of people who, were now free, but had no skills, had no money, had no place to live. I think hearing Elizabeth talk about these issues and seeing her commitment to making not only her own life better, but the lives of other people better, I think that had to have had some kind of influence on him, not perhaps as an official advisor, but just daily interaction or nearly daily interaction and learning from her lived experiences that there was a lot more going on that perhaps he was not aware of and other complications that he needed to take into account when formulating some of his actual policies.
And that initiative of hers had quite a profound impact, I gather.
It did. And, when talking about what her legacy was, I think it really is immeasurable. We do have her memoir and the way that it gives insight into this extraordinary experience she had, and also the innermost working of the White House during the Lincoln era. But we will never be able to know the vast extent of her influence as a teacher in founding the Contraband Relief Association and seeing and personally participating in the education of all of these newly emancipated people who came to DC. She personally taught sewing and cooking and basic household skills to help people as they were making their way in freedom for the first time. And then the number of young Black women that she took on as apprentices and gave them skills as dressmakers so that they could become entrepreneurs as well and establish their own lives. We will never know the extent of that. And of course, she was also a teacher at Wilberforce University. Her extent as a teacher and helping other Black women, especially, make their way in this wholly transformed United States must have been profound. And, that is something that I hope she is also remembered for.
Yeah. And, we're trying to, and what we do is we call it also rediscovering the history of Washington, D.C. It's amazing the lack of scholarship around this capital, which itself only became a capital because of a few founding fathers deciding they wanted the capital in the South because they didn't want it in that abolitionist leaning state of Pennsylvania.
Right.
But understanding what is unique about this place, it has produced. It still is not a completely full participant in the American experience. We still don't have voting representation, but it has produced an awful lot of leaders. And you're wondering, where did that come from? And how did that happen? And you want to go back and say, well, someone like Elizabeth Keckley must have helped also establish some of the contours for what became a very important power center, not only for all of America, but especially when you think of a recently emancipated community for Black America.
Her memoir helps establish, she was really seizing control of literature and of memoir as a way to establish herself as a member of this newly United States, because taking authorship is really something that it's in a way it's claiming power for herself. And I think that we remember her because of her book that she wrote. And we know her because of her association with Mrs. Lincoln. And that makes me wonder, what other stories don't we know?
Yeah.
Because they didn't have this particular connection to these historical figures. And I think we can get insights into that by probing more deeply into primary resources. And just for an example, one of the families that she boarded with, the Walkers, they were Black free people in DC, and they ran a thriving catering business. And so how many other, there was a strong, thriving Black middle class in Washington, DC before emancipation and onward. And I think that we would all be enriched, not just people in DC and not just Black Americans, but all Americans would be enriched by knowing more about the lives of all of these Americans. Um, and I hope that that scholarship is ongoing, and I hope that with new resources that we have for digitizing archives and the wonderful commitment that our librarians have to archive and preserving these documents, I hope that more and more of that will come out, and I hope to see more and more of that in the public schools. I wish that I had learned about Elizabeth Keckley in my history classes, and so many other people like her, and I would really like to see that happen. And I try to do my part in the fiction that I write. But the work of historians that's ongoing, I think, is so absolutely crucial to all of us to understanding the real and full story of the United States, and of course, Washington, D.C. in particular.
Well, there's such a confluence of sort of a new expression of citizenship that occurs in the country as we're approaching the Civil War. So it would seem to me, one, with obviously the abolitionist movement, because we the people had a rather narrow definition with the founding fathers, but also with the suffragette movement that is also developing at this time. It's interesting that both are happening, and Frederick Douglass is trying to, be in both camps, and both camps are also, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others are working with Frederick Douglass as a way to get the benefit of the abolitionist movement. But I'm not certain why we suddenly see this kind of energy happening, and clearly it plays itself out rather dramatically.
It certainly does. And yes, Frederick Douglass was one of the few men, he might have been the only man at Seneca Falls at the convention. But yes, there has traditionally been a kinship between the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement. Unfortunately, white suffragists have not always done right by their Black sisters. And we see that in the 19th century, we see that all the way into the 20th century. And I've written about that in some other books, but we see that with Ida B. Wells Barnett, and how her work for suffrage, her work with the anti-lynching movement, and how she wanted to participate in the 1913 Women's Suffrage March, and she was told she could participate in a segregated group rather than marching with the other women from Illinois, from her home state. So I think that in many ways we do see collaboration between those two parties, but unfortunately it was not always wholehearted. There were plenty of women who wanted suffrage for themselves, but not for Black women. And I think that all of these issues are so fraught and so entangled. And I think we do no one any good by pretending those problems weren't there. We don't do ourselves any good if we pretend they aren't going on today. I think that part of looking at history and celebrating the heroines and the heroes of the past, we also have to look at their failings. We also have to look at where they went wrong, and where, as a country, we haven't always lived up to the promises that we made ourselves in the Declaration of Independence. You brought up one thing, Lincoln. I admire Lincoln greatly. I certainly do not think that taking all of the newly emancipated slaves, former slaves, and shipping them off to Africa was in any way a very good idea. And I think Frederick Douglass rightly set him straight on that. We do have to accept, we have to look and we have to reckon with where these people we admire from the past went, where they did well, while also accepting that they also had some, moral gray areas. And turning away is not the answer. Dealing with them civilly, I think, and with integrity and with the honest questions, I think, is the way to go.
Well, one of the sort of to close it out, that one of the purposes we see in examining history, one is just to share it. It's important, like you point out. But, we learn from it. It informs us about what we may be struggling with today. And possibly only because of what we're struggling with today, at least for me, I'm a political scientist, not a historian. But when I read this history now, I appreciate that this was, not to overdo this term, an inflection point in American history when Lincoln came into office. It almost seems preordained, all of the events that unfolded in terms of, Lincoln. So I believe, he always had a premonition about his purpose in life. He was a man who spoke aggressively about thinking slavery was immoral, but certainly was not prepared to be an abolitionist. And how all of the events that unfolded, from my vantage point, occurred during Holy Week.
Yes.
I mean, the Appomattox, Palm Sunday, here's the fatal blow, Good Friday, and the country convenes to mourn him on Easter. And Booth, he also had sort of a almost preordained. How did he happen to show up on April 14th just to pick up his mail? I mean, it's not like at the Ford Theater and then say, "Oh yeah, this is my chance." It was the country moving in a certain direction, and as the world was exploding with new definitions of who gets to be we the people.
Right, and that the situation of slavery, it was untenable. It was never going to last. It couldn't, because it's inhumane and it wasn't going to be able to endure. But there were some people who were willing to just, well, you know what, eventually it's going to die out. You just have to be patient. And that's easy to say if you are in a position of safety and you're not the one who's suffering. One of the things that I love about writing historical fiction is that it gives me the opportunity to explore all these different issues and answer the questions that kind of explore issues that pique my curiosity. But I'm often asked, why not write biography? Why not write history from a nonfiction point of view? I turn to fiction and my writing because one of the things that I think fiction does is that it puts you into the perspective of that narrator, of that fictional character. And it not only gives you a description of what happened, it's not only a narrative of what happened, but it also gives you a strong sense of how it felt. So you're put into that person's point of view, and you vicariously, through the reading, experience through their eyes. And I think that helps develop your empathy. If you can understand more why a fictional character is making these choices or confronting this issue in this particular way, I like to believe that not only will that give you a better understanding of the story itself, of the historical era it covers and the people it describes, but I also hope that it will give us the skills to use that empathy in our real lives. If we're asked to understand if we're kind of giving ourselves the training to understand how fictional characters behave, we might use that empathetic impulse to understand what's going on in the world now. And I also think that reading history and reading historical fiction can inspire us. We can see that people very much like us went through very difficult challenges in the past. and they drew upon their resources. They joined together and they overcame them, or they at least did the honorable thing and tried to overcome those challenges. And I think that can tell us that if they did it, then we can marshal those same strengths and that same community organizing to overcome the struggles that we face today. Sometimes our struggles are very different. Sometimes they are remarkably similar. But looking back to the past and taking those lessons from history can inspire us to empower us to fight the challenges that we face now.
You're a wonderful writer,
Oh, thank
and
you.
you know, you really are. And you know, I said that we will close it up, but still, I'd have to say when you said what you did about having empathy. You know, her visit to her formerly enslaved, where they were also relatives. You know, people
Yes.
forget that that you know there's such a complicated history that we never want to address that they were relatives. And so I mean, some she didn't like and hated, you know, and these were ones with whom, in spite of it all, there was some personal emotional connection and stayed with them several weeks. I thought that was a very rich moment uh, because makes us deal with those contradictions, those complicated moments, you know, and you certainly have it all over the place with Thomas Jefferson and people like that, you
Right.
know, what a complicated history. And because we're so not honest about it, we struggle with all of that still today. But you are a magnificent writer. It's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to read your work. It really is, and you bring such passion and insight to your work. And you've been a great asset to us here in the room with Jennifer Chiaverini. And you know, I'm so self-conscious of my ability to pronounce any name other than something from the South that I always stumble over. That's why I'm totally empathetic with people who do this in the public arena. But thank you very much. You've been a wonderful asset to us. And I encourage everybody to read Mrs. Lincoln's Dressmaker, as well as any number of other wonderful works, including all of your works in the area of quilting. And for those who want to learn more about what we're doing here, it's at ipph.org. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.